Hi everyone. My story comes to you from the East Coast of Canada, where our hockey allegiances aren't always the Maple Leafs. But I still really enjoyed the analogy earlier, and my 6-year-old, I can't wait to tell him that story. He's just gonna love it. My team did not make the playoffs, so you might be able to guess who that is. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be here with you today and to share my story through a lens of equity from work in Nova Scotia. I have a beautiful picture here of a picturesque lighthouse, which is a common one that you see when we're talking about Nova Scotia. So first, I do want to start by acknowledging that the early learning and childcare context that I'll be speaking about is located in Mi'kmaq on the ancestral Nunsita territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And there's also a number of founding cultures that really make the early childhood context a little bit unique in our region. I had the opportunity to speak with you a little bit later today, so I'll get into some of those details later. But some of the things I wanted to raise at this point is, first, our smaller population. We just surpassed 1 million people across the province, which I know is a drop in the bucket of what it is here in Ontario. But it's an interesting context because of our urban-rural nature. About 40% of our region is within a rural area, and that's one of the stories that I'd like to share today with respect to some of the geographical limits and gaps with respect to childcare. We also have a rise in immigrant families, and that is part of why we're now over 1 million people, and I'll share more of that a little bit later as well. And there's also the context of the socioeconomic inequities that plague our province, such as the poverty rates. Right now, about 1 in 4 children live in poverty, although those stats have been a little bit different the last couple of years, and again, more on that later. For my next 9 minutes during the panel, what I'd like to focus on is a story that actually picks up from something that Armin mentioned with respect to focusing on public systems that already exist, looking at our schools. So I'm going to tell a bit of a story of the way that childcare is delivered in Nova Scotia, looking at the market-based regulated childcare system compared to our public delivery of a pre-primary, which is also very similar to your junior kindergarten program in the province. Our pre-primary program is quite new for our province, and it operates really through an early childhood lens. It is delivered by early childhood educators, and it follows our early years curriculum framework. It was fully implemented across the province in 2019-2020, and now it's fully available across the province to all children that need a space. It is an accessible program across the province. The market-based privately delivered childcare system is made up of commercial operators and nonprofit operators. The publicly delivered system targets, again, that year before typical school entry, so 4-year-olds. It's free to families throughout the school day with now school bus transportation. Finally, that's done. And also before and after school programs are available for a fee. So one of the things I wanted to show in relation to these two systems, my team, I also have a team who's here supporting me, helped me map it, what the systems look like in the market-based childcare system compared to our pre-primary program, which is that public delivered system. So the map on your left is the childcare centers, the market-based childcare. All the blue dots represent where childcare is located, and on the right-hand side, it is our schools, which is where pre-primary early learning and childcare is available across communities. So at a first glance, you can see some of the gaps that exist. But when you actually go a little bit deeper into looking at, again, some of our geographical locations. Has anyone been around the Cabot Trail? Yeah, beautiful. Very difficult to pass during the winter, right? So let's tell that story with the lens of thinking about right in the winter, January, in that area. So this is a case example of a child care gap from a family living in Ingonish, which is point A on the map. So Cape Breton-Canso, another important context, is one of the historically high rates of poverty in the region. So to access childcare, travel is at least an hour and a half to Cheticamp, which is point B, or at point C, it's an hour and a quarter. Alternatively, to access pre-primary, it's about 25 minutes. And you don't have to worry if there is a spot in pre-primary. You might travel to get to childcare, but there might not actually be a spot for you. And also you have to have access to a car, and you have to be able to pay for the gas in the car. So some of those examples provide a real illustration of where the deserts really are. And this is just a really simple exercise that we did through Google Maps, thanks Randy, in just showing what those gaps look like across the province. And we do have some data around enrollment that further validates this access issue. So on the left, there is just a screenshot of something from the Early Childhood Education Report that shows the growth in enrollment for childcare for children 2 to 4-year-olds attending early learning and childcare. And there has been a growth over time. So about 50% of our children that are able to attend early learning and childcare. But what we've seen in pre-primary is it's almost 3/4, and this data is a couple years old, and I would say it's even greater at this point. So we know that focusing on a publicly funded system using the infrastructure of schools can help to create access in places where access doesn't exist. So I'm going to jump now to our early learning and childcare agreement, which was announced in January 2022. And on the screen there, it's an article that a colleague and I, Dr. Christine McLean, and I wrote for the Conversation Canada that talked about how important this agreement was, given its emphasis on the provincial organization to manage childcare and the public system that it promised. So what was in our agreement a year and a half ago now was the focus on a new provincial organization to manage childcare, a prioritization of not-for-profit care, and an action plan that really focused on affordability, accessibility, quality, and compensation for early childhood educators. So following this announcement, those of us working in early learning and childcare were quite excited. I actually had the opportunity to be part of the announcement as a parent and also as someone working in research. But what quickly followed was response from the sector and response from families about concern about what that would mean. So you can see here just a few screenshots of some of our local media that really started to talk about childcare. It's interesting how all of a sudden a lot of people wanted to talk about it. So great in terms of raising profile of the importance of early learning and childcare, but what was really missing was the lens of equity from families and children. So you can see here some of the headlines are the aspect around tough decisions. That was when there was a deadline around joining the new public system. The concern around female entrepreneurs bound not to cave in. And then very quickly, the deadline to join the program was actually lifted, and there no longer is a deadline that exists. And what happened was a shift from implementation and commitment to this provincial system to more of a consultation emphasis. There's now an engagement table that's really emphasizing that, and we've lost that momentum where we were really excited back in January. So currently, and you can, if you're interested more in our agreement, this is just taken from our provincial website around some of the goals that are currently highlighted. There is the aspect about affordability. Childcare fees are reduced. There is expansion happening, and it is happening in the not-for-profit sector, but that's really an existing childcare centers. That doesn't really start to address the gaps that I showed with respect to families living in rural areas. There's also the aspect about the workforce. So we did release our compensation framework in the fall. It's not quite at the living wage for ECEs in terms of where they are at in our province, so there's certainly still a lot of room to go. And as I mentioned, the aspect of the provincial organization is really more about consultation and engagement, not about that commitment to that emphasis of the publicly delivered system. So in closing, just a few aspects just to highlight aspects around equity and the path ahead. I think that aspect of critically examining and addressing, and in our case in Nova Scotia, the socioeconomic and geographical disparities is really essential. We need to know where those childcare gaps are and build a system to address that. The market-driven model does create inequitable access to childcare for families, and we see that just through, again, a simple map of seeing where the gaps are and what that really means to a family who's looking to access childcare. And there is that opportunity to think about our existing publicly funded systems, perhaps like schools or other community infrastructure, to enhance equity and to really build that equitable early learning and childcare system. So that's it for me. Thank you.